So I have another question, but I'm going to save it because I think it is tangentially related to A Brighter Summer Day. So we'll put a pin in that. And I suppose now is the time that we can move on to our preliminary thoughts on A Brighter Summer Day, which is our BFI Sight and Sound 100 Greatest Movies of All Time list pick for this week. It is a film by the Taiwanese director Edward Yang from 1991. It is nearly 4 hours long. I wouldn't even I don't really know where to begin with it, so I'm just going to say that my personal history with the film is that I tried to watch it twice without finishing it. The first time was probably the beginning years of my college experience, and I wasn't as into long and slow movies as I am now.
He is
And
very into
it
them. Very into them.
it didn't catch me on the right day, and I don't think I got past half an hour. Nothing against the film with that though. And then I tried again maybe about a year ago, and for circumstances out of my control, I couldn't brought away from the film, and I got through about an hour, and I just never managed to return to it. So, with that being said, I watched it a week ago, and then I watched it again last night. So, I wanted to be fully prepared for this discussion on the film. And I guess my question for Chandler, who this is essentially my first time speaking about this film, my first viewing of it. This is Chandler's first viewing.
Yeah.
So I guess Daisuke has seen it a number of times. So Chandler, let's hear your general thoughts, and then maybe
Oh,
hear from Daisuke.
it's so much movie, I don't even know where to begin. And I don't mean that in terms of its length, because the length is obviously daunting, but I never felt it never felt like it was 4 hours long. Something like Lawrence of Arabia, which is almost a half hour shorter, I towards the end I just thought, oh, when is this going to be over? But this, I think the constant references to War and Peace are very appropriate, because this is probably the most novel like movie I've ever seen. There's just so much going on in the character and the settings specifically. I did a little bit of research ahead of time just because I wanted to get a little bit of a history of Taiwan in this whole debacle, because my Asian history is very rusty. But yeah, I sat through the whole thing. It never really felt long, and I'm still struggling to understand how I feel about it. I definitely like it. I don't even know where to begin with something this monumental. Cat's my favorite character, I'll say that. Just right out the gate. I really enjoy Cat. And the restaurant scenes were some of my favorite. And again, this is coming from the guy. I literally just saw Yi Yi for the first time a month ago when it came up on this. And I've owned A Brighter Summer Day and Criterion for a few months now, but I've just always been so intimidated by it. It's not the length that has anything to do with it. It's just, I don't know. People have such a strong attachment to this movie that I'm always waiting for the correct time, the correct headspace to jump into it, because I don't want to do this movie a disservice. And I think I did, I went in at the right time. But when I remember when I first was done with it, when it was over, because I watched it last Saturday. When it was over, I just thought wasn't sure if I liked it, because at the time I felt that the main character, I wasn't really into him all that much. But it's one of those movies that over the last few days I've just been thinking about nonstop, to the point where I think I love it. Much like a good book.
So Daisuke, your experience with the film and preliminary thoughts. I know you've talked about it on your channel before, but a little repetition is needed here.
And non-spoiler, correct?
Non-spoiler
Yes.
for now.
Sure.
Yes.
So far.
Sure. So first of all, I'm very happy to hear your reactions to it. This is a film that one of the things I'm so happiest about is hearing people's reactions to the film after having seen the film for the first time. And even if someone says, "Oh, I didn't like it," or "It was okay," or something, I'm very happy to hear those comments as well, because at least, right, it's very daunting in terms of its length. You're absolutely right, and I think that's one of the main things that might be as a kind of turnoff for a number of people, and again, not unreasonably so. I think it's very reasonable to look at a film and look at its running time and think, oh gosh, this is going to take a big chunk out of my day. Is it really worth getting into? And that's a very understandable position to have. So I'm always happy when I hear people talk about the film and watch the film for the first time. And so thank you very much for sharing those great reactions. And as far as the film itself goes, I think you've mentioned it. The running time, I suggest, goes by very quickly. It
It
says on the
does.
back, right? It says on the back, what is it, 4 hours or so? But
It's 4 minutes shy of 4 hours.
right,
3:56.
right.
Yep.
So 3 hours and 56 minutes, which is still very, very long. The time goes by very quickly. And also, for anyone who may be listening to this film now or listening to this podcast now and has not yet seen the film, of course, it's ideal to watch it in one sitting. And it's, as I say, it goes by very quickly. But if you have to watch it in separate sittings, maybe in 2 sittings or 3 sittings or whatever, even so, that's still worth it because this film can grab you, and it can really just take you to another place in time. You were mentioning about how an understanding of Taiwan history is very important. I would say it's essential. It's absolutely essential in trying to get one aspect or number of aspects of this film in terms of the mise en scène, what happens in the foreground and the background. There are little details that hint at or go into this idea of one's relationship, between China and then Taiwan. And so this relationship is not only essential in terms of the actual story, which is in the 1960s, but also metaphorically in terms of displacement, in terms of what our identity is individually and as a nation, and how that figures in very specifically to the character trajectories and arcs that we see and observe throughout this 4 hour running time. So, in other words, everything is tied together. The individual
Mhm.
story is tied into the national story, and that's tied into an almost spiritual story, and it's all interconnected. And it's done in such a way that a filmmaker like Edward Yang does so brilliantly and so precisely. We've seen it, you'll see it, of course, in the later film that he did, Yi Yi, with such precision and magnificence. But here, it's also on display uh, so astoundingly. And it's still a marvel and a sight to behold every time I see it. And so, but you're right that there's so much going on. And it's very difficult, I think, to keep track of all the little who is who and who is belonging to what and all this. And I understand that. But even with that, there is still a sense that one can get as to what is generally going on. And of course, the more one understands and appreciates Taiwan cinema and history, I think it maybe is there is a certain ease of entry, shall we say. I'm not an expert in Taiwan history at all. I'm not at all an expert. I haven't studied it formally, but I do appreciate the need for that kind of at least general approach. And so, with all that, this is to say that there is so much here. It can be confusing, it can be daunting, but also it is a sort of transcendental experience to see the way in which characters evolve and move through time and space and interacting within and among each other, sometimes leading to interesting resolutions, sometimes leading to unexpected resolutions. But it's all here. And ultimately, universally, it is a human drama. And even as I suggested, an understanding of Taiwan history it might be ideal. One can still get into this film without necessarily having a grasp on that particular aspect of world history or history from this part of the world. And this is because this film does have so many elements that make it universal and human and understandable. How we react to people, how we try to understand other people's existences. What is it about us that makes us that makes us able or unable to appreciate the experiences of the other, and how that has ramifications going forward. It has so much here that can be understood, as I say, on a historical level, but also on a very emotional and human intuitive level, which is why I think it's very important. But on top of that, it is a powerhouse of an emotionally packed film.
Yeah, I my experience, I was almost worried that I wasn't going to like the movie, because much like Chandler, I had heard so much about it. It's on the top 20 of the Letterboxd, and it's on the BFI list, and it as Chandler mentioned, I am someone who loves long movies, movies that take their time to develop multiple strands of storyline over a excessive but wonderfully excessive runtime. And I think I guess my selling point for this, for a brighter summer day while watching it is an experience unlike any other that you're not going to get with any other film, that you would normally watch, that is a quote unquote normal length. That I while watching it, I became aware, both the first time and more so on the second time, I became aware of my own thoughts during the film,
Mm.
of kind of an ebb and flow as I was watching it, of not when I became disengaged with the film, but when I started to, at certain points, kind of take a step back and think about it in my mind, versus when I was more reacting to it on a purely visceral level. And I really have to say that I enjoyed the experience of when you're watching, let's say, a movie like, um, a Marvel blockbuster, or you're watching something like Parasite. These are movies that grab you by the hand and take you through their narratives from beginning to end, and you don't have much time to breathe throughout it necessarily, to necessarily gather your thoughts and start ruminating on what the film is trying to get at. And I think a film of this length, it almost, on one level, it's just a character thing where you're 2 hours in and you've already spent so much time with these characters, and you still have 2 more hours to go, and you feel with them in a way that you can't be in a shorter film. It feels, the artifice of filmmaking, of characters, where if you have like a 90-minute movie, you are forced to go through a very tight, concise character arc, that no scene has can be wasted. Everything must be propelling the film forward. With a film like Brighter Summer Day, it lingers on moments that only later, only 2 hours later, become of significance. And I often got chills while watching the film, realizing, what was happening over the course of the film. And it's just struggling to really describe, adequately convey the fact that the experience of watching a 4 hour film like this, and I don't think this film, I think maybe the film, An Elephant Sitting Still, has a similar kind of effect. Although I would say something like Lawrence of Arabia does not have a similar effect as this film. That's a more kind of plot character. Uh, those are the wrong words, but
Well, those other films are a lot more goal driven in the sense that every 30, 45 minutes we get a pretty good idea of where it's going. They introduce new conflicts or new characters that very clearly drive the story in a particular direction, whereas this is just so free flowing. It jumps from character to place to location on seemingly a dime. And it's, I think the issue that I had when I initially watched it is I thought of it in the sort of structure that you're explaining right now, where I thought the main character, whose name is, I always forget,
Shao
Sir,
Sir, yes.
Shao Sir. I thought of Shao Sir as I thought that this was a movie about Shao Sir, because he's the one who's first introduced with his father and him having to go to night school. And it wasn't until about 2 hours in that I realized Shao Sir is not the main character and this is not his story, but Shao Sir is sort of the center of everything that's going on. and he's the sort of narrative device that we use to explore his father and his dealings with the corrupt Taiwanese officials, the different gangs and the sort of psyches that go behind the different gang leaders. Just the entirety of this feeling of displacement is sort of explored through him and how the actions of the world around affect him. And I think it was right around that midpoint that's where I started to realize where that was going. And I think now that if I saw it again, I would be able to appreciate it so much more, knowing that it's not, like I said, it's very novel-like in its structure. It just jumps. And in any other movie, I said this with Yi Yi as well. In any other movie, just jumping between characters like that would feel so jarring and you'd feel misplaced, but he just really guides you really easily. And I think a huge part of that is just how consistently beautiful but still the imagery is. You never feel like you are out of this world. Yeah.
Daisuke mentioned that you need to have a particular knowledge of history of Taiwan to really appreciate the film. And I think that's very much true. And I just want to summarize my non-spoilery thoughts with this, that as I was watching it, I knew the history of Taiwan, but there's a very brief title in the beginning that gives you the little setup of what is going on. And I think that no one should be put off by not knowing history from this film. I don't think you need to know it in order to enjoy it, because there is so much mood and atmosphere and it puts you in that place. I learned through kind of osmosis things about Taiwanese history that I felt compelled to look up after the film and learn more about. And I can only just say that I fully, emphatically recommend this movie to anyone who is willing to. If you're not willing, I suppose maybe not. But if you're willing to take that step into something that is novelistic, that is exploring a society, not just one person, because it is exploring Chaucer, but it's a portrait of a society, and it's wow. I still am speechless, but yeah. Comments on those thoughts, Daisuke, or we can move on to a more kind of spoilery thematic discussion.
I think those are great comments, my friends. Those are really great. Yeah. I mean, and also the idea, I'll be very brief, but this idea of how it's like jumping and going from character to character or situation to situation, like a novel. I'm really taken with that in particular, because this is sort of the thesis, the cinematic thesis, if you will, of Edward Yang's uh, cinema. As you know, in watching his other films deal a lot with the tapestry of a number of characters. The word I use a lot when I describe his films is interconnectivity. And this is because the cinema of his works, in particular this film, shows a kind of way in which we are all connected, or these characters are connected. And we don't realize these connections until, as you say, maybe an hour, 2 hours from that initial scene, which is, I think, very revelatory. And it's a not just a poetic way of expression in cinema, but it's also there's a kind of a hypothesis or thesis that is being posited by Edward Yang and company with respect to the human condition, I think. So I'm very thrilled to hear your comments about that. It's very insightful.
Okay, so that's, I suppose, here's our little spoiler warning before we get into some more specifics about the film. And here's my question, I suppose, for Daisuke and maybe for Chandler. And this can just, don't have to answer it immediately. It can be a thought to put a pin in. But this is a film that is so very Taiwanese, that is seeped in the history, culture, society. It is Edward Yang's recreation of a very specific moment in time and a historical event. Is it possible for foreigners like us, or from anyone outside of that society, outside of Taiwan, and perhaps for Daisuke and Japan in general, and Japanese film, is it possible for someone from an outsider's perspective to truly get everything there is maybe to a film? And I don't think you can ever really get everything about a film, but is there something about, let's say, Brighter Summer Day that is maybe ungraspable because we are disconnected from the time and place to a certain degree?
I don't know. 'Cause obviously, there are very certain plot elements that are very much rooted in this Taiwanese history, but I think there's a lot in this film that is a lot very universal. I think there that sort of feeling of loss of identity is not only in the people of Taiwan, but I feel like it's a sort of loss of identity that people feel at that age in general. So I think that Taiwanese history aside, this does work as a coming of age story, albeit an epic and thorough one. But I think that the historical aspects of it can really only heighten the experience over time. Because I think going in with just as little as you know from the opening text, you can get a good amount of the feelings that this entire country is feeling. I think one of the particular scene I always think of in regards to this is when they're having dinner and the mother comments, "We were at war with the Japanese for 8 years and now we're living in a Japanese house listening to Japanese music." I think that feeling, while we can't necessarily relate to it on a specific level, that feeling of a loss of identity is pretty universal. But I don't think I think he does a fantastic job at going in relatively blind.
That's a very good point. I think I would add in the context of, let's say we're talking about A Brighter Summer Day, there are some aspects, for instance, about dialect and language usage that are very significant, but that cannot be caught by someone, for instance, like me, who doesn't speak that language. And this is very important too because this is spoilers, right?
Yes, we're
Okay,
in
so
spoilers.
as you may know, right, the language of Chinese, the Chinese language that's being used, has different dialects depending on the region or the area, and this is also true in Taiwan. And so what Edward Yang does so brilliantly, and yet in such a way that it's very difficult for me to identify because, as I say, I don't speak the language, and so I have to rely on commentary tracks and supplemental features to show me the way, is that sometimes you'll have characters that have different dialects that are from different regions. Let's say from the regional part of Taiwan versus the mainland China, and even within Taiwan itself, North and South is often referred to a lot, and this is very significant because this is getting at the very root of of a sort of a very nuanced Taiwan identity. And what this is going at is that we have sort of the the local regions, and then we have the Chinese that came in from the mainland around the time of Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang from 1949, as a way to, as of in terms of the break with the communist regime in the mainland China, and that therefore became Taiwan, or the Republic of China, as it was officially referred to, officially speaking, right? And then but in that in that context, therefore, which is captured brilliantly in this film, we have all these different tensions that are arising. We have the local Taiwanese group or population or people. And then we have the people coming in from mainland China to Taiwan. And then we have the idea of people who are still in the mainland China. And then on top of that, we have relationships that are resonant about the past. As you indicate, there are many aspects of Japanese culture that are in Taiwan right now. And I have a Taiwanese friend, and we've spoken about this film a lot, and he has relatives who remember this, and how there was actually a really a very big influential sort of Japanese cultural influence in terms of architecture and in terms of the Japanese people that were there up to the end of the war, but before that as well. And so and it there is a very interesting cultural sort of I don't want to say relationship necessarily, but there is an interesting way in which that Japanese kind of those aspects of Japanese, shall we say, stuff resonate in an interesting way in the context of Taiwanese character and that history. It's not necessarily an antagonistic one, although I know that there are elements there as well. I know this, but at least based anecdotally from my friend, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And so I want to suggest that there is just so much going on here in terms of who is from the mainland now in Taiwan, who is left behind in the mainland, who is actually been in Taiwan versus coming out from the mainland here. And therefore, you get all these tensions between the characters, right? You have the uncle and then the parents. There's a little bit of tension there, right? And because the implication is that he's been here, whereas the parents and Xiao Sur and his family have come from the mainland. We have this tension also about who's left behind, who is still here, and what does that lead to in terms of the father and his suspected links with communist China,
Mhm.
right? And that leads to a whole thing in the middle of the film about him and the pressures that are imposed upon him psychologically in terms of torture, essentially, and how that has an impact not just on sort of national as a statement on national identity, but also on him as a character, and how that has ripple effects as far as him and his wife and his family, and in particular Shao Sur. So this is all to say that this is all so sort of integrated fundamentally into the film, it's a very fundamental aspect. But as you said earlier, you can still enjoy this film without necessarily appreciating that stuff. So. This is all my way of saying that there are still lots of things about this film that I don't get and I will never be able to get, in particular, how language is used.
To add on to that, I think I read somewhere, I don't remember, that the mother and the father speak a
Mm,
Shanghaiese dialect when they don't want to be understood by their kids, which, unless I didn't
Oof.
if I didn't read that, I'd never know.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily that, a foreigner would never get it, but that it takes digging into real kind of passionate digging into a film if you want to really understand it, if it's coming from a different place than you're used to. And I was reading the director's notes in the Criterion edition of A Brighter Summer Day, and Edward Yang says something very, very interesting that I absolutely love, and that um, he talks about how that it's horrifying, and I quote, "It is horrifying to think that man might have to depend on his own species for the truth for hundreds of years. Luckily, there are enough clues left by the great minds of the past in their art, architecture, their music, their literature, to help the future generations to somewhat reconstruct the truth and restore our faith in humanity. Films must serve this same purpose for our future generations." And I think it's thinking about A Brighter Summer Day in the respect that those are Edward Yang's thoughts, and I very much almost see the film as his kind of testament to this moment and history in time, and is almost an educational material, although we don't often think of fictional film as being such, for future generations, and not necessarily an educational material trying to get at any kind of accurate historical truth, but at a kind of general feeling, the facts of eliciting curiosity from future generations about the past. And this film very much um, elicited those questions about Taiwan from me. And I very much saw a lot of the actions in the film as maybe not direct allegory, but some kind of metaphorical meaning to kind of the greater China and Taiwan relationship. And I might get into that later, but I'll let
Well,
someone
I just
else
also
say
thought it
something.
was interesting that it's not only a film that's based in this really real history, but it also ties into a real murder case, which I had no idea that this was based on a true event until afterwards. And I kind of wish that I knew a little bit more about that, but at the same time, that would kind of ruin the impact of that final act. But it's just crazy to me how he manages to incorporate all of these different historical aspects together, and it never pulls its focus into one direction, as far as the specifics go. And yeah, one other detail I didn't know that was that the Taiwanese military, when we see Sure and who's the woman's name, the little girl's name? I always forget her name too.
Ming.
Ming, yes. When we see Sure and Ming, on the field together, and you can see
Mhm.
all the soldiers practicing in the background. It wasn't until I was doing my research today that I learned that the Taiwanese government, their military, they were attempting or planning on staging a sort of war to take back China. And I just think it's interesting because at a certain point, the Chinese government and the economic power of it just became so big that they just sort of had to give up on that. But it's the same thing I felt with Yi Yi, that there is always another completely different story, a completely different movie just happening in the background, and I'm just blown away consistently throughout this movie how this is never just characters. It's not a character movie, but how they fit into this larger world, this larger narrative. The backgrounds of these shots, there is always movement, there is always life. Even in the schools, when it's just two characters talking in a hallway, you have somebody in the background, at the book stand or whatever. You have people on their way to class, you have faculty going through the hallways, and it's just, I think that's what really sells this feeling of being part of this world. And I just wish I watched this a little bit earlier, because I you just have to sit with this. And like you said, Daisuke, it's a movie that I don't think you'll ever really be able to fully understand. Not in the same way as something like Mulholland Drive or Twin Peaks, where there's just little tiny micro scenes that I don't understand, but just how all of these characters and events and play into these themes that is also laid out in the history. It's just so dense and so interconnected, so flawlessly, that I don't think I'll ever be able to fully understand it, but I think that's why I love it. Also beautiful, just beautiful to look at. I was watching some of the restoration footage that they did, where they essentially had to restore it from old VHS slash Laserdisc rips. And God, the people who restore these just do wonderful work. That and the Apu trilogy, I think they did a fantastic job on.
I do want to say also, just to piggyback off of what Chandler was saying about the background and images, you're absolutely right. There's so much movement going on. And to talk just about your comment about the military, even in the background of some of these shots, for instance, between Shao Sur and his father as they're walking, you can see military in the back. You can hear
There's
these,
tanks
yes,
always going through the tanks, yeah.
exactly, and that just is another indication of it's not it's background information, but it's also information that is linked into all this the historical moment, as you say, and it's a very precise historical moment. And it's not all military stuff, don't get me wrong, but that's an
Mhm.
example of how how should I put it? How baked in these elements are to a very fundamental level in this film. So that's a very good observation.
Yeah, it's just God.
It's for me. I kind of was reading it as when I said a almost a metaphor for Taiwan. It's that the Taiwanese people having fled the mainland, and the Chinese people really having fled the mainland and moved to Taiwan, have become kind of untethered from their roots, and authoritarianism essentially was ruling the island. Fear of communism, and there was a lack of tradition, a lack of a central culture that they could probably call their own. That they have been disconnected from their homeland. They're listening to, like as we said, Japanese music.
Mhm.
They're watching a John Wayne movie. They're singing American songs without. I never got the sense that they even knew what the songs were about or could
Well, they barely
they
had the
couldn't
lyrics
understand
translated.
English.
I love those
Right.
scenes. Yeah, translating the
Right.
lyrics.
And it's a portrait of a nation and a society that is very restless, that is trying to find its own identity, that's trying to fit a new mold that it's been put in, that they've been transplanted from one place to another. And it's kind of like Chaucer in that he's trying to find his own identity, being surrounded by all these other elements that aren't him. The gangs, he's not a part of the gangs, but there's a pull towards that kind of violent, anti-authority behavior. There's the music and everything. There's the film is about a society trying to find its place, trying to figure out what it is, and it's also about a character, Chaucer, trying to figure out who he is. And I think I might be reading too deeply into it, but at the end, um, Chaucer is trying to save Ming, and almost like how Taiwan is trying to go back and save the mainland. But in real life, they accepted reality eventually, that cold reality they had to
Mhm.
to to live with. And Chaucer was unable to live with that and acted out against that. And it's little layers. It's just like you could find all these different readings. I was making so many notes, and I could honestly talk forever about it. So I don't want to. We have Daisuke here, so I want to hear just a little more from him before we have to go.
Well, speaking of Chaucer, he's a very important character, as you suggest. We see his struggle even early on. We see his proclivities towards, at least potentially anyway, acts of violence, even early on. And we know what he does at the end of the film, very, very tragically and horribly. He commits a terrible, terrible, terrible act, of course. And we see the way in which it affects both him and the people around him. But we also see glimpses of that early on. I don't know if you recall. It was he sees, what is it, the uncle, and there's a little bit of antagonism between the families. A little bit of jealousy, perhaps, is implied because of the right, in terms of the children and their daughters and getting into school, etc. But also there's a little bit of antagonism in terms of who's coming in from the mainland, who's been here longer, and that sort of thing. So I think it's the uncle who's been a little bit antagonistic, and there's a moment where he's having, I think, a heart attack. Or no, 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 I take that back. He's drunk, and we see a moment where Chaucer we see him grab a stone, and he's about, and
Yep.
no one's
Yeah.
around, and we see the implication is he's thinking about actually assaulting this person, but then he's there's a sickness, and so that little uh, uh, terrible temptation is averted, of course. And we also see his reaction towards the acts of violence and the results of violence in the aftermath of the gangland violence. Right, the Little Park Gang and the 217s and other ancillary groups as well. But those are the two main groups that are at play here in this particular film. And there's the antagonism between those groups that culminates in a very terrible bloodbath around the middle of the film, as you know, and we see his reactions to this kind of terror. But there are also a number of elements of his character that I think are important to keep in mind. For instance, remember there's an issue about his eyesight.
Mhm.
Right, there's a thing about maybe something to do with the fact that his eyesight has not been properly properly addressed, shall we say. Maybe that has something to do with how he is performing academically. Maybe that has something to do
Oh, I
with.
didn't think about
I,
that.
I mean, there's nothing very clear about that, but
Yeah, yeah,
there is
yeah.
something about his eyesight and how he's seeing or has trouble seeing, or he focuses on certain things. The idea about the light opening the beginning of the film, the little light bulb. This is a
Hmm.
very clear a metaphor for the idea of seeing and sight and the inability to see. And I think this is also very important with his character, not just in terms of this little character trait, but also in terms of how he, the character, sees or is unable to see the characters around him, and how he tends to uh, maybe glorify or romanticize certain aspects of the people around him that it might ultimately be unjustified and also quite disappointing. This is very clear in terms of, for example, how he looks at people like Honey, the character of Honey. This is also very clear in how he perceives characters like Jade, well, the other very important a character in the film. There's Ming and then there's Jade, but how he perceives Jade, and what we realize is that his perceptions about her character are not really what she is about. This is also true, of course, in how he perceives Ming, which is perhaps one of the central relationships of the film. And it's this sort of failure or inability to see what it is she sees herself to be is a kind of precursor or a catalyst for the ultimate doom and tragedy that will lead to the climax of this film. So this character of Shao Sura is very interesting in terms of his ability to see and not see, and I think that is shown throughout the film, not just in terms of cinematic symbolism, but also in terms of the character and how he perceives the reality around him.
There's a lot there, and it's one of the, I go often go on my Letterboxd, and I and lists online, and I'm trying to figure out, like, when is the next time I'm gonna watch something that's truly great, that I'm gonna love. That this is kind of my summarizing thought here, but that I watch a movie, and I say to myself, how many more masterpieces are there left for me to watch that I will truly connect with? And I think that I'm always surprised. I don't know why I would be, because there's so many more movies to watch, but I'm surprised when I watch something like A Brighter Summer Day that I I have pages of notes and could go on for a very long time. And it's it, I light and as you were talking about the metaphor of light, and how Chaucer smashes the light bulb and then gives up the torch at the end, giving up these light sources. And there's just a lot of little metaphors, a little the way that Edward Yang very deliberately moves his camera in the film. There's not a lot of movement, but when he does, it's very purposeful and frames the action in just the way it needs to be, and it's visually just marvelous. And that's that's just all I have to say about the film for now.
I got nothing, man. I think even what I said didn't even scratch the surface, and it's been a while since I've had a movie that just left me, I don't want to say speechless, but just unsure. Unsure. I was worried because when I first saw it, I thought I didn't like it. I thought I was just I thought it wasn't clear, but now in retrospect, I think it was as clear as it needed to be, and I have to fill in the gaps later. And I think I was just expecting something a little more streamlined, like Yi Yi. But in retrospect, I think I like this more because it's not as streamlined, I guess.
And also, if I could add, this is a discussion in the context of the BFI Sight and Sound list, right, from
Yes, I almost
2012.
forgot.
And this is what is it? It's in is it the 70s or so, or
I think it's in the we used a combination because they posted a director's list and a critics list.
okay.
So we matched them together, so we got all of the movies. I'm not entirely sure, but it's somewhere in the
Some
70s.
fudging of the numbers, but yes, it is. It's in the lower end of the list, but
So it's be somewhere between 50 and 100, something like that.
Oh
right?
no, not even that. It's oh no, yeah,
probably
it is.
around the
It's-
70s.
Okay.
It's in like the 70s to 80s, but yeah.
Okay. So I think I don't have the critics list in front of me.
84.
Thank you. So
Sorry.
84. So on the critics list, right? Okay.
Yes,
correct.
So this is very significant, right? Because this list was published in 2012. This film was, of course, first released in 1991, but it was never really given a restored showing, I think, until 2010, 2011, something like that. I think it's 2011. And And this Blu-ray from Criterion was released, I want to say 2016. I apologize if my dates aren't wrong, but that my point that I'm trying to make is that it's a really amazing just how in terms of because when the list came out, I still remember that film was very difficult to be able to watch in a kind of good quality. And then, of course, after the list was released in 2012, then we get this now great, glorious Blu-ray from Criterion. And so more people now hopefully are being able to see it and appreciate it and enjoy it. And so it's very interesting to see, first of all, just how well the film did at that 2012 point, considering all the circumstances and considering how, relatively speaking, little time the world really had with the film up to that point, 2012. And then now there's more time that people have with the film. And so it's now, I think, with great anticipation, just how this film will fare at the next BFI critics poll, which I think is going to be what,
Soon, yeah.
2022? Yeah, in about 2 years from
soon.
now.
Every 10 years.
Then we can restart the
But-
podcast. Start from the beginning.
It's
Yeah.
I think honestly for both Brighter Summer Day and Yi Yi, I think they will only go up in those polls.
Probably.
Um,
Yeah.
For me, I think I like Yi Yi a little bit more, mostly because I find it more relatable on all the character level. But I think A Brighter Summer Day might be the film that I respect more, that I think is a more monumental achievement.
Yeah.
And if I were to be so bold as to go in and start editing the BFI website, I might move it up a little higher than where it is now.
Well, yeah. I have said multiple times in the podcast that I'm a firm believer of one film per director. So if I had to choose between the two, I think I'd actually go Brighter Summer Day. Yeah. Just because I think it's a lot more emblematic of his style, and I think it's a lot more challenging and unique. And I think there's a lot more potential for meaning, but I guess that's relative anyways. That's objective. But yeah, I'm going to say deserves to be on here. There we go. That's how we usually end it, is whether or not you think it should be on the list.
Which I think it was 3 yeses there,
Yeah,
essentially.
okay. There we go.
Yes, yes.
Highly recommend.
Well, Daisuke, it was an honor to have you on here for this episode. I wish we could have talked for ages about this movie, but I think we got some good, unique thoughts about the film out of this conversation.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you. It was a real honor. You know, I don't get invited to many podcasts. I get invited to few, but not that many. And so when I get the invitation, I'm always very thrilled. So thank you very much. It really, really, thank you so much for inviting me. It was a real honor. Thank you.
Of course.
Well, next episode, we're going to be doing Salo, or the 120
Yeah.
Days of Sodom. That's the big one. Neither of us have seen
Nope.
it.
I have to buy it.
And
Okay.
who's our special guest?
His
Chandler?
name is also Chandler, interesting enough. He's a huge fan of both Daisuke's and Brighter Summer Day, and he
Okay.
was very excited to discuss this film. I said, nope, we have to go with Daisuke. You know, his schedule allowed it. And I think if it was anybody else, he would have been upset, but he replied with very, very enthusiastic. He is probably more qualified than I am. So,
Oh, I'm
Very
very sorry.
excited.
Oh, please extend my deepest apologies and thanks and gratitude.
oh,
And-
he is excited. Don't worry.
And but he will be tackling a film that I also am I'd love to be able to talk about one day. Salo. I think that is a very interesting work to be able to talk about, and it has a lot there. There is a lot there. So
There's a lot there.
yeah.
I agree.
So I look forward to your discussion about that very much.
Very fun.
Well, thank you very much again.
Thank you, my friends. Thank you, and cheers. Talk to you soon.